Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Film Haven Reviews. I'm your host Sawyer as always, and today we have a very special episode just because this is the 104th episode, which if I'm doing my math correctly, that means 52 plus 52, which means this is the 104th week, which means this is 2 years of the podcast. So I know I just celebrated my 100th episode, so we're not going to get too into it, but yeah, 2 years in a row. 2 years in a row of podcasting, not missing one Friday. Very happy for that. Thank you for everyone who has been following with me. I feel like I've grown a good amount of consistent listeners and a lot of people from around the world, which is really cool. Shout out to my Frankfurt guy or girl that has been following me since pretty much like the first or second episode, which is awesome. Love a dedicated listener. And of course, my friends and family that have been listening to me since the beginning as well. But yeah, I think we are actually growing, which is really cool. It just takes a while. But anyway, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds about the 2 years. We're just going to keep going because in the end, that's all we're going to be doing is just talking about movies. And we're going to be doing it next week and next week and next week for as long as I can. So anyway, this week we are doing a special movie because Gene Hackman died a few weeks ago. And I just wanted to tribute him a little bit, do a movie that I was already going to be planning on doing, and ever since doing French Connection almost a year ago, I'm kind of been a little bit more fascinating with him as in his career. So today we're going to be doing Night Moves from 1975. Now, when I think of Gene Hackman, I think of some of his movies from the 90s and early 2000s, just because that's the movies that were on when I was growing up. So I think of weirdly, was it Behind Enemy Lines? I think of Enemy of the State with Will Smith. And Quick and the Dead, the Sam Raimi movie. Those are kind of the Gene Hackman roles I know. But as I grew up, I did see Unforgiven, and I've heard Mississippi Burning is really well done. So there's a couple of Gene Hackman movies I need to see, and of course, like I said, last year did the French Connection, which is cool. And that was really interesting to see him in an early role. He was very young, relatively young for Gene Hackman in the 70s. Especially with his career later in the 80s and 90s. But anyway, today was also kind of young, 1975, Night Moves. We're just going to get into the overview because there's lots to talk about and lots of comparisons with Chinatown. We're going to be doing that ad nauseum, so get ready for that. So 7.5 out of 10. Could have been a little bit, I think 7 out of 10 originally, and then as I was doing a little bit of more thinking afterwards, and then there's this, where we're going to referencing them a little bit later, but there's this reviewer on IMDb that just made this incredible user review that is better than any article that I could have read after looking stuff up. It's just really breaks down some of the things that makes this movie a little bit deeper than I was expecting, or that I experienced when I first watched it. So I would say I'll give it a 7 with a 0.5 kind of added for the depth that I found kind of post-op. So yeah, more depth than it seems, but the experience of a movie is still important. So I think that's dragging it down a little bit, of course, as well as some other things. Compared to Chinatown, it's not as masterful, which at the same time, that's a hard comparison. But also at the same time, it was a contemporary of Chinatown. And at the time, it was actively being compared. So I don't think I'm really that weird for comparing these two movies. I think it's pretty on point and definitely on theme, of course, 70s Neo-Noir theme. So on a plus side, Gene Hackman is amazing, and we're going to go have a whole breakdown of that as well later. But as far as the overview goes, those are the kind of the things. It's a little deeper than you think, but it's at the same time, I was a little underwhelmed. It's not as good as Chinatown, and Gene Hackman is great. So let's get into the narrative because, of course, it's convoluted because it's a neo-noir film, and what neo-noir film wouldn't be convoluted? I take this time to say, hey, watch this episode on visual format and YouTube, Spotify. Both of those links are going to be in the show description. Spotify is technically free if you want to download that. For those of you that don't, if you want to watch this, and also YouTube is of course free. And follow those links on the show notes so that you can watch this, because I'm putting a lot of time into putting these clips up, and I think it would be I think it's a much better experience for people to be able to see what I'm talking about rather than just trying to keep up with my words. And that goes doubly for when I'm talking about the narrative, as in the case with what I'm about to say right now. So let's get into it. Harry Mosby, played by Gene Hackman, is a retired professional football player who is now a private investigator and is tasked by a promiscuous, aging B-movie actress, Miss Iverson, to find out where her rebellious daughter, Dealey, is. So, he's this guy who's just he's a private investigator, very standard in that way, but he's a little bit unstandard because he used to be a professional football player. I guess for the Raiders, they don't really say specifically, I don't think, but you definitely get that sense because he's got a Raiders poster in his like kind of man cave. But anyway, yes, Mrs. Iverson, who is this very, you could tell it reminds me a little bit of Sunset Boulevard. It's like Sunset Boulevard, the lady from that, where she's like this retired actress who still can't get over the fame, her glory days. Very similar actually to Gene Hackman in a way, being the professional football player. But it's like Sunset Boulevard, but she's a B movie actress. Like she even says a line where she's like, "Have you seen any of the movies that I was in?" And Gene Hackman just gives her a blank stare. But she kind of has the air of like, I'm a star. I'm an aging star, even though she's definitely not. She just had some good marriages and some very good divorce settlements. But anyway, while investigating his mark by interviewing various ne'er-do-wells in the low-budget movie industry of LA, Harry is also investigating his own wife, finding out that she is having an affair which he struggles to confront. So yeah, that's like kind of the really interesting stuff. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but like at times there's like a bait and switch where you think he's investigating his mark when in reality he's investigating his own life, which is very interesting. Eventually, Harry pulls on enough threads to find out that Dealey is possibly living down in the Florida Keys with her stepfather Tom, and he sets out to the Sunshine State to see if he can find and bring Dealey home, only to uncover a deeper mystery that he must decide to pursue or ignore. So yeah, that's a fun story. I think it's interesting. It's very classic in some ways, right? Like he's got, as all these private eye noir films go, he's tasked with something, and the thing that seems simple ends up being a little bit more complicated. But the way that they wrap around the kind of his personal life in this film is maybe one of the things that makes it a little different than Chinatown, which I enjoyed. So speaking of things I enjoy, I think I'm going to break this review mostly down by things I liked and things I didn't like. So things I like, there is a couple of good shots. If we're talking about cinematography, I would say it's not like incredible. We'll get into that maybe in the things I don't like. But I wanted to highlight at least one kind of scene that I thought was pretty stylish and moody in a way that I really enjoyed. And it's towards the beginning after he gets this commission from Mrs. Iverson, he has to, of course, do some research on Mrs. Iverson and her daughter. And so he gets his, I guess, secretary. I don't know if they ever explained this, but it's like a robotic almost voice, or sounds like a voicemail of sorts, but it's a tape recorder of someone who has obviously done some research on these characters, Mrs. Iverson and her daughter, and it's kind of relaying it to him while he's driving down what is maybe the Sunset Boulevard. And it's just a really beautiful shot, thinking like the LA version of like some Taxi Driver scenes. And that movie, of course, was 1974, so that makes sense. He's got this really nice green Mustang that he drives. And so just the lights on the car and him driving down the road and listening to this exposition, basically, I thought that was really well done too. Just very stylized and moody, and I really enjoyed it. And when you look at movies like The Driver that's going to be coming out later with Walter Hill, or I think around the same time, you can definitely see how the style of like really cool movies and cinematography is developing actively during this time. And I also just liked for the viewer, he's learning about the story at the same time you are. And it's, so there's like almost like a B-roll audio overlaying just a cool scene of him driving. And you think that he's driving to investigate his mark, Dealey, and try to figure out some stuff. But really, there's that, like I said, that bait and switch where he's actually just going to the theater to sit outside and stalk his wife to see if she's really going to see the movie theater with her friend, or if it's a lover. And of course it is a lover, which is very interesting. So moving on, the score is, it's interesting because it is one of the things that I like, but when you compare it to Chinatown, it's just they don't compare. Chinatown's score in kind of made the movie better. It made each scene that it had better. It was very diverse. All like I talked about last time, the low piano score, the piano tingles, the way that it boosted tension. I mean, all those things were masterful. Whereas in this movie, it is a good, solid, like kind of funky, modern funky curiosity detective beat kind of score. And at times it really did work for moving the story forward, or maybe giving you something to listen to while scenes are transitioning of sorts, or while characters kind of coming onto a scene and then getting out of the car, stuff like that. It definitely gives you that sense of kind of, for the time, modern day curiosity, the bottom, that kind of stuff. And everybody knows that. So that's the thing, is that it's more of its time, but which makes it fit like the actual movie pretty well. But it also doesn't really stand out particularly well. So I would say, while it's a little bit more generic, it is very well done. And I would say it's one of the things that I would say is good about the movie. But it kind of interesting that even on the things that I'm talking about that I like is not, I still have some caveats there. But really the thing that kind of shines in this movie, and the thing that I would say is giving it that 7 out of 10 that then turns into a 7.5 is Gene Hackman. And also his character, Harry Mosby. I really enjoyed those two characters, or the actor playing the character. I think that Gene Hackman does a really good job at displaying the complexity of Harry Mosby, and showing that, exuding his complexity in a subtle ways. So the acting is very good, but also it means that the character himself is written well. I think that his character is 100% like what carries the film. And he's very complicated. So like being retired, it seems like he's dealing with regret and has a hard time connecting with his wife. In the end, he's lonely, and he doesn't really know how to like reach out for help. He doesn't know how to deal with his loneliness. There's something about him that's maybe repressed, or he just doesn't know how to handle his emotions very well. He's struggling. He's struggling morally as well. Being a private investigator, obviously you're dealing with people. You're dealing with people's kind of seedy problems, and there's like a moral quandary just to be in that business in and of itself. You can always just say, I'm just doing my job. But at the same time, when you're looking after, trying to find a young woman of the age of 16 who is very obviously being sexually exploited by older men, that brings up some issues. That brings up some moral quandaries. And then just in general, as he goes down to the Florida Keys, he meets a woman, Paula, who is definitely kind of pulling on his morality, because he knows his wife has been cheating. And so now he's kind of like, I think it's easier for him to maybe decide to do the same. And eventually he does. But at the same time, I think his character in general is kind of emblematic of all the characters in the movie. Maybe all those characters have little shards of themselves that are kind of put together into his character. Because as it seems that everybody kind of has like everyone in the movie seems to be morally dubious, like on some level, or morally lost is maybe a better way to put it. They're kind of like lost in the moral sauce, and they don't know which way is up. The moral compass in this film is like going all over the place. And that is very much embodied by Harry Mosby, who is conflicted on how he wants to deal with the infidelity of his wife, about whether he wants to partake in infidelity himself, how he wants to handle Dealey, all those things, whether he wants to be a part of kind of pursuing the thread of possible like criminal activity that is happening, that is he going to put a blind eye to it, or is he going to investigate it? Is it really his job? Is it his business, or does he have a moral duty to do that? And so there is like just this kind of back and forth of morality, being lost, being lonely. And I really appreciated that. I think that's one of the strongest, it is the strongest part of the movie, is that kind of following with that narrative. And there's also kind of a narrative of generational trauma, because you have this young girl who's being promiscuous and also being exploited by older men. And that is, as you learn throughout the movie, the mother, who is this aging starlet, she has enabled that, as well as kind of teaching by example. And then there's even a line towards the end where Gene Hackman is confronting her, and she's basically saying, she didn't have it rough, I had it rough. And you kind of see that generational trauma thing. everyone's dealing with trauma. Everything's, there's this kind of ambiguous relationship that Gene Hackman had with his father, and that comes in. And then, of course, he's got this complex relationship with being a retired football player. It seems like maybe there's like a little bit of that glory days regret. There's something about it that he regrets. Because there's even a mention, he's constantly playing chess in the movie, and he talks about these, like, for example, in 1922, there was this grandmaster that famously missed a very smart move he could have played to win the tournament or whatever, and he didn't do it. And Gene Hackman basically says, like, I know he was probably regretting it for the rest of his life. And you kind of get the sense that maybe he's projecting a little bit there. But they don't really necessarily hold your hand with that, so you have to kind of derive a lot of that, which is good. I think that's a well done on their part, and I think that's one of the reasons why this movie is maybe more famous than I would say the quality deserves it to be, if that is a sentence that even makes sense. But anyway, let's move on, because I did like that. I think that the whole theme of the movie revolves around Gene Hackman and his character. And I think he did a really good job acting, and I think that Harry is a really well done character. In some ways, right up there as far as complexity with Jake Gittes, if not a little bit more complex. I think Jake Gittes is more iconic, and then overall just like a better, more interesting, not more interesting, but more entertaining character. But I think that Harry Mosby is more interesting and more deep. So anyway, let's move on to the things I didn't like. So I talked about the story. The story is one of the things that makes it good, but the story pacing is one of the things that I'm side-eyeing a little bit. So I think that I was engaged, which is good. I very much was watching. I wasn't bored, but I was teetering on being bored. If it didn't just give me enough at the right times, then I could have easily seen myself kind of feeling a little listless. So it's like, you're playing with fire. The story itself is just a lot drier, ironically, than Chinatown's, because that movie's about a drought. But, it just, Chinatown was just giving you everything. And so you were constantly leaning in. And like, especially like Mrs. Mulwray, like at the beginning in the first 20 minutes, not being the real Mrs. Mulwray. And that just like heightened the curiosity so much that it keeps you in. And then it consistently does stuff like that to kind of make you keep wanting to watch. And this movie, don't get me wrong, it definitely was engaging, but it was just a little more like consistently anticlimactic versus Chinatown. So I would put the story pacing, maybe, I think the depth of the story was really good, but the story pacing is one of the things that I would say could have been better. I think that they could have thrown in a couple more things to kind of spice things up, give it a little bit more zhuzh, and then I'd say the biggest thing that's kind of really dogging this movie to me is that story element of having this minor be so sexualized and technically abused by these morally dubious men and women, her mother, and even Paula, the character in the Florida Keys. I mean, she's just kind of letting this girl like go roam free and be possibly, I think it's even hinted that she's engaging in sexual acts with her stepfather. So that's like, once again, more incest. These two movies do have that in common. But it's just, there's a couple scenes where she's like naked and she's like supposed to be 16, and it's just like, it's icky. The movie's a little icky when it comes to the sexualization of this 16-year-old girl. I think I get that it's part of the story. It's part of increasing that kind of moral dubiousness as a theme in the movie. But it's just, I think that the male gaze of the 70s society is very much present in the film, and so it makes it's kind of hard to put your finger on, but I feel like you can just kind of feel that the movie is not as respectful as it could have been, and it doesn't age as well as some other movies like Chinatown. So while there was some heavy stuff like incest in Chinatown, the way that they did it was a lot more subtle and a lot more respectful. Whereas in this film, it just there's just something about it with that, especially with the 16-year-old girl, that just felt icky and didn't feel like it aged well at all. So I think that's one of the big things that's making this movie not hit 8 or higher for me. But I do see the point, and I know that it was a movie of its time, but some movies age better than others, and I think that's one of the things that are ticking away in this film. But the craft is well done. So that is good. Talking about things I did like, the craft is well done, but then sliding into things I didn't like, it wasn't anything spectacular. I wasn't oohing and awing like I was in Chinatown. And that's, once again, not fair necessarily to be comparing two movies too much, but because, as we'll talk about later, the similarities in genre and the similarities and the kind of foundational elements of these two movies, I think it is kind of fair to compare the movies. And if I am to do so, this movie is like good where Chinatown is great. The Craft, putting it in the don't like column is maybe not correct, but I had to kind of point out that in comparison to Chinatown, The Craft was not great. But I think in comparison to a lot of other movies, it was fine. It was good. There was some, like I pointed out earlier, that scene on Sunset Boulevard. That was a good scene. And there's probably some more that I could point out if I rewatched it again, that I was focusing more on the story. So there were some maybe shots. I've heard that the underwater shots were really well done, like for the time. And it was like some famous underwater photographer or videographer that was working on the movie. So there's definitely some stuff that you can say The Craft was good in this movie. I'm sure I'm a little bit out of my depth on the technicalities of that kind of stuff, but when it's really easy to point out why Chinatown is a good movie cinematography wise. So I think in comparison, it's just not as great. So anyway, speaking of comparing these movies and their foundational connections to the neo-noir genre, let's talk about those similarities to Chinatown. So like these two movies, foundationally similar. They're two private eyes who go down rabbit holes that open up, and importantly, without their full control. And this brings me to that user review that I was talking about at the beginning of the episode by a user on IMDb called the Red Duchess, who I looked through their other reviews. They've done a lot of like classic movies and some pretty they got some heady ideas on movies, and heady perspectives maybe is a better way to put it. They definitely are looking into movies more than your average person. And the way that this review is written, like I said, it's better than most articles I could have read. So I'm going to quote it a couple times because I think it really helped me understand the extra depth that this movie has. And so for anyone, look up the Red Duchess on IMDb and read some of their reviews for movies that you like, because I support it. I think that they have some really good takes. But anyway, so the Red Duchess, for example, had brought up this concept that I had not heard of, and I'm going to definitely do some more research on now afterwards, of the anti-detective film. They say that Night Moves is kind of like the quintessential, or maybe the master of the anti-detective film. And I can definitely see that now that I'm just thinking about the concept of the anti-detective. And it made me realize, it just like boomed into my head that, because they also mentioned that Chinatown is a contemporary of that genre as well. Chinatown, and then the movie that we're going to be doing next week, Farewell, My Lady, also in this same realm. So in a way, you can call this theme the anti-detective theme. And we might do another one later because I want to do some more research on some other movies that fit that description. But the thing is, at the end of both movies, now I'm not going to do too many spoilers with this movie, Night Moves, because I don't think it's really necessary. But I can say that the ending is abrupt. The ending is abrupt in the same way that Chinatown is. It's tragic and abrupt. Something tragic happens, and importantly, and something I didn't even think about, is that Jake Gittes and Harry Mosby have this in common. The ending is completely out of their control. By the end of the movie, let's use Chinatown, for example, and you can very easily just overlay this to Harry, is that Jake Gittes, they get to Chinatown, as everything I talked about last week. Faye Dunaway gets shot. It's extremely tragic. And when you look at Jake Gittes, he's just like, he is in shock. He is completely like kind of going numb from the situation. And the whole time, that whole scene, he had nothing to do with it. All the events were just unfolding around him. So he was much more of the observer, a spectator, rather than the doer. He didn't save anyone. Nothing happened. He wasn't smarter than anyone. Everything was just out of his control. Very anti-detective. When you look, and the same goes for Harry in this movie and Night Moves, the same ending of sorts. It's very similar, where this like crazy stuff happens, a lot of revealing happens, and someone dies, and he is just sitting there and has no control over it. And so when you look at, the best example I can think of is, I'm sure a lot of classic noirs as well, but just Sherlock Holmes, for example, is this detective who always has he's always got a little trick up his sleeve. He's always one step ahead of the bad guy, that kind of stuff. They're like all knowing almost. They're like omnipresent knowledge of things. They're too smart to be fooled. Whereas in this movie and in Chinatown, they're not too smart to be fooled. They're very real. They're much more tactile characters where they're not untouchable. They're someone who can mess up. They're more, as we see here, morally lost in Harry's case. And by the end of the movie, I mean, it shows that just like in life, for a lot of things, it's just out of our control.
I didn't solve anything. Just fell in on top of it.
And that's why I thought it was fascinating to think about these movies as anti-detective films. So I'm very appreciative of the Red Duchess for bringing that concept up to me, because it totally makes sense. And I love finding these kind of microcurrents within cinema of genres, of kind of influences and kind of just threads that are happening throughout. Like, I mean, this is obviously a 70s detective thing. And of course, famously, the 70s is known as kind of the decade of the anti-hero, the Good Taxi Driver, once again. Travis Bickle is very much anti-hero. He ends up doing something really he's trying to do something noble, but he's definitely a dark and disturbed character. And so that is very emblematic of 70s characters and stuff like that. In this movie as well, he's very, Harry is not like a great guy, but he's not a bad guy. He's got shreds of decency. I think overall he's good, but he just like is morally lost. And that is much more inducive to this kind of anti-detective style where he's flawed and he doesn't know everything. And I'll even quote the review here. I think this is a great quote from the Red Duchess saying, when the solution is revealed, talking about the ending, it is certainly not any of Harry's doing. It is brought to him with bloody murderousness. Throughout the movie, we see Harry looking at people or things through blinds, curtains, screens, etc., his view impaired. He's an imperfect narrative. I mean, he's an imperfect protagonist. He's an like unreliable narrator of sorts. But I would say it's just more like, I think what it does in the end is it connects you as a viewer more to the narrative, because you're kind of learning everything right alongside the detective. So while this investigator is pulling at threads, he's not doing so with the competence that, say, Sherlock Holmes would have. He's kind of like, he makes mistakes. He makes bad judgments. He misinterprets things that he finds out. So I think as a viewer, it's more interesting for you to kind of go along with that imperfect narrative, because whenever the surprises happen, whenever the ending happens, it just affects you more, and you're kind of right alongside the main character as those things are happening. Best example being Chinatown, but this movie is also a good example as well. So in conclusion, reading this review makes me feel like, okay, yes, there is a lot of depth to this movie that I'm not maybe accounting for when I was first giving my rating of 7 out of 10 in my head. And so I gave it a little bit more, 7.5, because in the post-op, I'm seeing that there's a lot to get into with this movie. But at the same time, as I said kind of at the beginning, I just can't shake the fact that the movie was a little underwhelming to me. The story was a little just drier than Chinatown. The ending was very similar to Chinatown while not being nearly as effective. It was a gut punch, but it just was a little bit less of a gut punch than Chinatown. And considering it was made a year afterwards, it's just like, it's more of the same, but not as good. That doesn't feel great. So I can't necessarily give it a 9 out of 10. That's definitely out of the picture. And I don't necessarily think that an 82 Metacritic score is, I mean, that's a serious Metacritic score. If you're getting above 80, then you're doing something right. Or something that critics like. There should be something in there that I should be able to take and be like, oh yeah, for sure, this movie is really good, if I'm looking from a critic's angle. The user score is also, it's indicative. It's 7.1, so it's lower by a lot, by 11 points than the Metacritic score. So there's something in that as well. I think I'm not alone in saying that the experience of the movie and the depth of the movie are kind of two different things. And that's not always a great sign. So 7.5 is surely it's a really good score. And I mean, when you see me do my horror roundups for the year, 7.5 is sometimes in the top 5 of the year. So 7.5 is a really good score. And I would say for my experience, I'm giving it a 7. And then for my overall, just like final word, 7.5. And maybe I need to watch it again and I'll point some things out. And with my new perspective, maybe I'll enjoy the movie a little bit more. But for first impressions, I think 7.5 is honestly more than fair. And I think that, like, I watched this movie with Allie and her parents, and I haven't really talked to them about how they feel about the movie, but I feel like they'd probably go closer to 7, maybe even lower. But they were engaged too. I will say that they were watching the movie. And for a mid-70s movie, it can be hard to stay in with it. So I think that is a testament to the movie being a little bit above, it's above mediocre for sure. And when you put Gene Hackman into the role of the main character, it just elevates it even more. I think Harry Mosby and then Gene Hackman playing him is what makes this movie so good. And then there's a lot of things that are kind of pushing against it, but I mean, he's a legend for a reason. So that's it for this week. Next week, we're going to be doing Farewell, My Lady, which was the original movie that I said that I wasn't possibly going to be doing because the movie posters just aren't doing it for me. But at the end of the day, especially since it feels like a little bit of kismet that I had that movie on my list as the third movie in this theme, and then this The Red Duchess is literally mentioning Chinatown and Farewell, My Lady in reference to movies that are contemporaries of Night Moves and are within that same anti-detective kind of strand. So I have to watch it now, right? And it's 1975. It's the same year as Night Moves, so let's look into it. And Robert Mitchum is a good actor. I'd like to see him play a detective or a private investigator. So I think it's definitely going to be a lot more like Chinatown because I think it takes place in LA once again, and it's like kind of maybe 30s or 40s. So I'm excited to see that. But anyway, I hope you guys have a great week this week, and I will see you next Friday.